I inherited 1,800 acres. Then I discovered the entire HOA had been sitting on my land for years, so I legally tripled their rent overnight. Welcome, everyone. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Tell me the name of your city, state, or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Thank you for being here. Now, let me tell you how this unbelievable story began. The most expensive mistake someone can make is believing they own something they never bothered to verify. That was the sentence echoing through my mind as I unfolded a crisp white envelope that had been tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my old Ford F-250 less than an hour after I arrived at the property my grandfather had left me. The paper crackled in my hand while a warm Texas breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and sun-baked cedar across nearly 1,800 acres of rolling hills, scattered oak trees, quiet ponds, and open pasture that had belonged to my family for generations. Instead of feeling welcomed home, I was staring at a notice from an HOA informing me that my truck violated neighborhood parking regulations and that I owed a fine if it wasn't moved immediately. I looked up from the letter toward the enormous stone entrance standing several hundred feet away. The words Hollow Creek Estates were carved into polished limestone, framed by manicured flower beds and expensive iron gates that gleamed beneath the afternoon sun. Golf carts drifted through the entrance as if the place had existed forever. Children rode bicycles along perfectly paved streets. Sprinklers hissed across emerald lawns. Everything looked peaceful. Everything looked permanent. And every single inch of it was sitting on land my grandfather had never sold. At least, that's what I believed. My name is Ethan Walker, and until 3 weeks earlier I had spent most of my adult life working as a forestry consultant, helping ranchers preserve timber and wildlife habitats across Texas. My grandfather, Walter Walker, rarely talked about money. He believed land was more valuable than cash because land remembered every generation that cared for it. Whenever I visited him as a kid, he'd point across the horizon and say, "People think they own the future because they have a deed to a house. Real wealth is owning the ground beneath their dreams." Back then I thought it was just another one of his old sayings. I had no idea those words would eventually reshape my entire life. After his passing, I expected to inherit a modest ranch house and perhaps a few hundred acres. Instead, the attorney slid a survey map across his conference table showing nearly 1,800 contiguous acres still titled under my grandfather's family trust. I remember staring at the map for several silent minutes because it simply didn't make sense. Roads crossed the property. A clubhouse appeared near the center. There were lakes, walking trails, tennis courts, and hundreds of upscale homes outlined in neat rows. The attorney calmly explained that my grandfather had leased portions of the property decades ago under agreements that had evolved over time, but he insisted I study every document before making any decisions. I promised him I would. I wasn't interested in becoming a developer or forcing anyone from their home. In fact, I wanted the opposite. I planned to preserve the ranch, restore neglected wildlife areas, and honor the promise my grandfather had quietly kept for decades. That simple plan lasted exactly 42 minutes after I drove through the main entrance. Before I had even unloaded a single box from my truck, a woman wearing a navy blazer with a gold HOA badge approached me carrying a clipboard and the confidence of someone who had never once expected to hear the word no. She introduced herself as Patricia Holloway, president of the Hollow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Without asking who I was or why I had arrived, she politely informed me that unauthorized vehicles could not remain inside the community and that additional violations might result in towing. I glanced down at the citation, then back toward the entrance monument standing proudly against the blue Texas sky. She smiled with absolute certainty, convinced she was explaining the rules to another visitor who simply didn't belong there. I folded the notice carefully, slipped it into my pocket, and smiled back because there was one detail Patricia Holloway didn't know yet. Every road she managed, every gate she protected, every clubhouse meeting she chaired, and every HOA office she walked into each morning had been built on land that legally belonged to me. Patricia stood there with the kind of practiced smile that only came from years of believing every conversation would end exactly the way she expected. She held her clipboard against her side, while the late afternoon sun reflected off the polished badge clipped to her blazer. "I am sure this is all just a misunderstanding," she said pleasantly. If you register your vehicle with the association office, we can probably reduce the violation fee. I nodded politely, not because I agreed with her, but because my grandfather had always taught me that listening carefully revealed far more than arguing ever could. I thanked her for the information, climbed back into my truck, and slowly drove deeper into the community. Every turn raised another question. Beautiful brick homes lined the streets with perfectly trimmed hedges. Decorative streetlights stretched along sidewalks that curved around ponds stocked with bass. A clubhouse overlooked a sparkling swimming pool where families laughed beneath colorful umbrellas. It was impossible to ignore how well-maintained everything appeared, and for a brief moment I understood why people loved living there. Then I looked beyond the landscaping and remembered the faded survey map folded inside the leather portfolio resting on my passenger seat. According to those documents, every one of these impressive amenities had been constructed on land that my family still legally owned. I parked beneath a sprawling live oak tree overlooking one of the lakes and opened the portfolio once again. The original survey was surprisingly detailed, complete with handwritten notes from licensed surveyors dating back decades. My grandfather had highlighted several property boundaries using blue ink that had faded with age. Beside one section, he had written a simple sentence in careful handwriting. Never confuse development with ownership. I smiled because that sounded exactly like him. He rarely explained his notes, believing that if something truly mattered, the next generation would eventually understand it on their own. Growing up, I spent countless weekends exploring these acres beside him. We repaired old fences together, watched deer emerge from the tree line at sunrise, and fished in ponds so quiet that even the smallest ripple seemed important. He knew every hill, every creek, and nearly every oak tree by memory. Yet he never spoke with bitterness about the subdivision that slowly expanded across portions of the property. Instead, he simply reminded me that patience usually outlasted pride. At the time, I thought he was talking about life in general. Now I wondered whether he had been preparing me for something much larger. Before leaving the attorney's office, I had asked the obvious question that had been bothering me from the moment I saw the map. If my grandfather still owned the land, why had no one challenged the neighborhood years earlier? The attorney answered carefully. Ownership and occupancy were not always the same thing. Agreements changed. Easements expired. Leases reached their final dates. Records became forgotten as boards, managers, and attorneys came and went over the years. His advice had been simple. Read every page before reaching any conclusion. Those words stayed with me as I unfolded another folder containing decades of property tax receipts. Every payment had been made on time. Every parcel remained listed under the Walker Family Trust. There were no signs of unpaid taxes, forced sales, or ownership disputes. The paper trail was remarkably consistent, almost as if my grandfather had quietly anticipated that someone would eventually need to prove every acre beyond question. As the evening shadows stretched across the water, I noticed a maintenance golf cart driving along the shoreline. Two workers stopped beside a decorative fountain, adjusted the irrigation controls, and continued toward the clubhouse. I watched them disappear around the corner and realized something important. None of the residents enjoying the walking trails or fishing from the docks appeared arrogant or entitled. They were simply living their lives, trusting that the people managing their community had done everything correctly. Whatever had happened over the past several decades, I refused to let ordinary families become the villains of a story they probably knew nothing about. If there was a problem, it belonged somewhere much higher than the people planting flowers in their front yards or teaching their children to ride bicycles on those quiet streets. I closed the portfolio, looked once more across the peaceful lake, and made a promise to myself. I would not rush into court. I would not threaten anyone. I would begin exactly where my grandfather would have started, with facts, patience, and every document that could still tell the truth. The next morning began with the sound of sprinklers clicking across perfectly trimmed lawns while a thin layer of morning fog drifted above the lake outside my cabin. Fresh coffee steamed from a metal mug resting on the hood of my truck as I spread copies of the survey maps across the tailgate. Every property line matched the legal descriptions I had reviewed the previous evening. Every parcel number connected like pieces of an enormous puzzle that someone had quietly assembled decades before I ever understood why. I was still comparing boundary markers when another white envelope appeared beneath my windshield wiper. This one informed me that temporary structures required approval from the Architectural Review Committee before remaining on the property longer than 24 hours. I looked around in confusion before realizing they were referring to the small utility trailer I had brought with landscaping equipment. I could not help smiling. Less than one day after inheriting 1,800 acres, the only people acting like they owned the place were the board members of the Homeowners Association. Rather than feeling offended, I became curious. Rules often reveal more about the people enforcing them than the people receiving them. After breakfast, I drove to the association office, a beautiful stone building overlooking the clubhouse. The lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh paint. Framed photographs of neighborhood events covered the walls, celebrating holiday parades, community picnics, charity races, and tree planting ceremonies that stretched back more than 20 years. The residents clearly cared about their neighborhood, and I respected that. A receptionist greeted me warmly before asking whether I had come to pay my violations or register my property. I introduced myself simply as Ethan Walker and requested copies of the community governing documents available to homeowners and residents. She smiled politely, handed me several neatly organized binders, and pointed toward a reading table beside a large window overlooking the pool. No one asked why I wanted the documents. No one seemed concerned that I was studying every page with unusual attention. For nearly 3 hours I read bylaws, architectural standards, maintenance policies, parking regulations, landscaping requirements, and enforcement procedures. The rules were detailed, professionally written, and surprisingly consistent. Yet one sentence continued bothering me. Throughout the documents, the board repeatedly referred to common areas under the association's control, but the language rarely described actual ownership. Instead, the wording emphasized management, maintenance, and operational responsibility. That distinction seemed subtle enough to escape casual readers, yet significant enough to deserve closer examination. Before leaving, I asked whether I could obtain copies of historical board meeting minutes. The receptionist explained that older records were stored in an archive room and would require approval from the board president. She smiled apologetically and suggested I attend the monthly meeting scheduled for Thursday evening if I wished to make a formal request. I thanked her sincerely and accepted the invitation without revealing why the records interested me so much. Outside, I walked slowly across the parking lot toward the clubhouse. Every step reminded me of my grandfather's handwritten note. Never confuse development with ownership. The sentence no longer felt philosophical. It felt instructional. As I continued exploring the property, I noticed maintenance crews repairing flower beds, contractors inspecting irrigation valves, and volunteers preparing banners for an upcoming neighborhood festival. Everyone appeared focused on improving the community rather than creating conflict. That realization strengthened my resolve. If mistakes had been made, they had accumulated quietly over decades through changing leadership, forgotten agreements, and unquestioned assumptions. I had no interest in embarrassing families who had invested their savings into beautiful homes. My concern rested entirely with discovering whether the foundation beneath those assumptions remained legally sound. Late that afternoon, my telephone rang. The attorney handling my grandfather's estate asked whether I had encountered any unexpected developments. I glanced toward the impressive entrance monument rising above carefully landscaped flower beds and quietly answered that the neighborhood seemed exceptionally well organized. Then I paused before adding one more sentence. It might also be sitting on the largest unanswered legal question I had ever seen. He remained silent for a moment before reminding me that facts always move slower than emotions, but they usually arrive at a better destination. I thanked him, folded another copy of the survey map into my leather portfolio, and looked toward the association office where Patricia's vehicle remained parked outside. She still believed she was managing every important decision inside Hollow Creek Estates. She had no idea I had stopped thinking like a frustrated property owner and started thinking like the patient grandson of a man who had spent decades quietly preserving every document that could eventually change everything. Thursday evening arrived with the sky painted in deep shades of orange and gold as the last sunlight reflected across the neighborhood lake. Families gathered outside the clubhouse carrying casserole dishes, folding chairs, and homemade desserts for the monthly community social that always took place before the Homeowners Association meeting. Children chased one another across the lawn while the smell of grilled hamburgers drifted through the warm air. It looked less like a formal board meeting and more like a small-town celebration, and that only strengthened my belief that the residents themselves were not the problem. They had built friendships here. They trusted the people elected to manage their community. I parked my truck near the edge of the lot, noticing once again that every parking space, every decorative light pole, every landscaped flower bed, and every brick pathway matched features shown on the old survey map, folded neatly inside my portfolio. My grandfather had walked these same hills decades before the clubhouse existed. Now hundreds of people enjoyed evenings together on land that still traced back to the Walker family trust. I stepped inside the clubhouse where polished hardwood floors reflected warm chandelier light. Conversations filled the room as neighbors greeted one another by name. Patricia stood near the front arranging papers across a long table with the confidence of someone who had repeated the same routine for years. When she noticed me entering, her expression shifted only slightly before returning to the same professional smile she had worn during our first encounter. "Mr. Walker," she said pleasantly, "I hope you had time to review our community guidelines." I smiled and thanked her for making them available. She seemed satisfied by that answer, assuming I had come to learn how the neighborhood operated. In reality, I had come to learn how the board thought. The meeting began with routine business: maintenance updates, landscaping contracts, pool repairs, budget reports. Everything appeared organized and transparent. Residents asked thoughtful questions about road resurfacing, drainage improvements, and holiday decorations. Patricia answered each one with practiced confidence. I understood why people respected her leadership. She projected certainty, and certainty often feels reassuring when no one has reason to question it. Then the discussion turned toward expanding the walking trail along the eastern side of the community. A large aerial map appeared on the projection screen, outlining proposed improvements that extended beyond the existing path and across several wooded acres. My attention immediately focused on those property lines because I recognized every contour from the original survey. The proposed expansion crossed directly into acreage that remained titled under my family's ownership. Patricia spoke enthusiastically about obtaining contractor estimates and scheduling construction before autumn. Several residents applauded the proposal. I quietly raised my hand. The room became still as Patricia acknowledged me with a polite nod. I asked a simple question. "Could you explain who owns the land where the new trail would be constructed?" The room remained silent for several seconds. Patricia answered without hesitation. She explained that the association managed all common areas for the benefit of the neighborhood and that the board had authority to maintain community property. Her response sounded confident, but it never actually addressed ownership. I thanked her and asked whether the association possessed a current deed covering that section of land. For the first time all evening, she paused. It lasted only a moment, yet everyone in the room noticed it. She replied that legal records were maintained by the association's attorneys and that operational matters were handled according to established agreements. Once again, she described management rather than ownership. I nodded respectfully and did not press further. There was no reason to embarrass anyone in front of their neighbors. The answer itself had already told me what I needed to know. After the meeting concluded, several residents approached me with friendly curiosity, assuming I was considering purchasing property within the neighborhood. We talked about fishing, wildlife, and the history of the surrounding ranchland. Many expressed genuine appreciation for the preserved open space surrounding their homes. Listening to them, I realized they valued the land just as much as my grandfather always had. They simply believed someone else owned it. As people gradually returned to their cars, I remained outside watching the lights around the clubhouse illuminate one by one. The fountain beside the entrance continued flowing quietly while golf carts disappeared into the evening darkness. Patricia locked the front doors, wished the last residents a pleasant evening, and drove away believing another successful meeting had come to an end. I stood alone beside the stone walkway, removed the folded survey from my portfolio once more, and carefully compared it with the image that had appeared on the projection screen only minutes earlier. Every path they planned to improve, every acre they intended to expand into, and every future project they proudly discussed rested upon the same overlooked assumption. They had spent years managing land without ever asking the one question my grandfather had quietly prepared me to answer. The following morning, I drove into the county records office just after the doors opened, carrying nothing more than my grandfather's leather portfolio, a notebook, and the quiet determination that had guided every important decision he had ever made. The building smelled of old paper, polished tile, and freshly brewed coffee drifting from a break room somewhere down the hallway. Ceiling fans turned slowly above rows of filing cabinets that seemed to preserve generations of local history one document at a time. I checked in with the clerk, explained that I was researching property records connected to the Walker Family Trust, and was directed toward the archive room where decades of surveys, deeds, leases, easements, and recorded agreements were carefully stored. I had expected the process to take several days. Instead, within the first hour, I began noticing a pattern that became impossible to ignore. Every deed transferring ownership of individual homes referenced residential lots exactly as expected, but none of those deeds transferred ownership of the larger underlying acreage surrounding the community amenities. Roads, lakes, greenbelts, clubhouse grounds, and recreational areas appeared repeatedly in supporting documents, yet the language consistently described rights of use, maintenance responsibilities, or access agreements rather than outright ownership. The distinction was subtle enough that most people would never notice it, especially after decades of routine management. I requested additional files dating back to the original development plans nearly 30 years earlier. One elderly records specialist smiled when he saw the dates I was requesting and joked that very few people enjoyed reading paperwork older than they were. I smiled back because those forgotten pages were beginning to tell a remarkably clear story. Around lunchtime, the clerk returned carrying several oversized survey maps rolled inside protective tubes. Together, we carefully spread them across a large wooden table beneath bright reading lamps. Colored boundary lines stretched across the paper with incredible precision. Every road intersection, drainage easement, utility corridor, and parcel number aligned almost perfectly with the copies resting inside my portfolio. Then I noticed something that immediately caught my attention. A recorded ground lease had been filed decades earlier between my grandfather and the original development company. The agreement allowed construction and long-term community use under specific conditions while preserving the family's ownership of the land itself. I continued reading every page with growing concentration. The lease described maintenance obligations, insurance requirements, renewal procedures, and a clearly defined expiration date. My pulse quickened as my eyes reached the final pages. Several amendment records appeared over the years, extending portions of the agreement through negotiated renewals. Then the documents simply stopped. There was no final extension, no replacement agreement, no recorded transfer of title, no permanent purchase. I asked the records specialist whether additional filings might exist under another reference number. He searched the database twice before shaking his head. According to the official county records, nothing had replaced the final recorded agreement. I thanked him and carefully photographed every page permitted under archive policy before returning each document to its protective sleeve. Walking back toward my truck, I felt neither excitement nor triumph. Instead, I felt the enormous weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. Discovering a legal issue was one thing. Deciding what to do with it was something entirely different. Hundreds of families had built memories inside that neighborhood. Children had learned to ride bicycles along those sidewalks. Couples had celebrated anniversaries beside those lakes. Neighbors had planted trees whose roots now stretched deep into soil my grandfather had quietly protected for decades. Whatever came next had to preserve those lives instead of disrupting them. That afternoon, I met with the attorney handling my grandfather's estate and laid every copied document across his conference table in chronological order. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. He reviewed each page carefully, making occasional notes before comparing them with the survey maps and tax records. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and removed his reading glasses. His expression remained calm, but I noticed something I had not seen before: genuine surprise. He quietly explained that the documents appeared unusually consistent. If no additional agreements existed outside the public record, the legal foundation supporting the community's continued occupation deserved immediate review by specialists in real property law. He reminded me once again not to jump to conclusions because every complex transaction carried details hidden beneath the surface. I agreed completely. Facts deserved patience. Assumptions deserved verification. As I gathered the folders back into my grandfather's worn leather portfolio, I realized the investigation had quietly crossed an invisible line. I was no longer searching for answers because I suspected something was wrong. I was searching because the documents themselves had begun asking questions that no one inside Hollow Creek Estates seemed to realize still existed. For the next 2 weeks, I barely touched the fishing gear that still sat untouched in the bed of my truck, because every sunrise began with another stack of documents, and every sunset ended with another page of handwritten notes spread across the old wooden table inside my grandfather's ranch house. The quiet rhythm of the property slowly returned around me. Mourning doves gathered along the fence lines every morning. The wind carried the familiar scent of cedar and fresh hay through the open windows. At night, I could hear frogs calling from the ponds exactly as they had when I was a child. Everything around the land felt timeless, yet every new record I uncovered suggested that time itself had quietly changed the legal relationship between my family and the neighborhood without anyone fully realizing it. My attorney introduced me to a real estate specialist whose entire career focused on long-term land leases, conservation easements, and legacy ranch properties. Rather than beginning with opinions, she insisted on rebuilding the entire history from the beginning. We arranged every survey, amendment, tax receipt, engineering drawing, and recorded agreement across a conference room wall in chronological order. Standing back several feet, the history unfolded almost like a timeline. The original developer had negotiated carefully with my grandfather decades earlier because purchasing the entire ranch would have been financially impossible at the time. Instead, both parties created a long-term ground lease that allowed the community to be built while preserving the Walker family's ownership of the underlying land. Over the years, the neighborhood flourished, developers changed, management companies came and went, and new homeowners association boards inherited responsibilities from previous volunteers. Each generation appeared to assume the legal foundation beneath the community remained exactly as someone else had left it. The attorney slowly traced one finger across the timeline until it stopped at the final recorded extension. "This," she said quietly, "is where everyone stopped paying attention. After the last amendment expired, no replacement agreement appeared anywhere in the county archives. We searched state filings, title records, archive correspondence, and even retired engineering files. The result never changed. Ownership remained with the Walker Family Trust. Operational management continued under the Homeowners Association. The bridge connecting those two realities had quietly disappeared years earlier. Even then, my first reaction was not celebration. It was concern. I asked the attorney the same question that had been bothering me since the investigation began. What happened to the families living there if everyone had relied upon outdated assumptions? She answered without hesitation. The law often distinguished between correcting paperwork and protecting innocent people. Homeowners who purchased houses in good faith were not my opponents. In fact, resolving the underlying land issue through cooperation rather than conflict would likely protect them far better than allowing uncertainty to continue growing unnoticed. That conversation completely shaped every decision I made afterward. I could have pursued aggressive legal remedies, but doing so would have punished neighbors who had done nothing wrong beyond trusting the system built before they arrived. That was never the legacy my grandfather intended to leave behind. Instead, we spent several more days developing a different strategy. I established Walker Land Stewardship, a company dedicated to managing inherited property responsibly while preserving conservation goals and community relationships. Independent appraisers evaluated comparable long-term ground lease rates across similar developments. Certified accountants calculated maintenance obligations, tax responsibilities, insurance costs, and future land management expenses. Every number was documented. Every recommendation was supported by professional analysis rather than emotion. The proposal we assembled was surprisingly simple. Existing homes would remain exactly where they were. Roads would stay open. Parks, lakes, walking trails, and community facilities would continue operating without interruption. The only meaningful change involved creating a new legally current ground lease reflecting present-day market conditions instead of agreements written decades earlier. As the final draft took shape, one figure immediately captured everyone's attention. Based on current valuations and independent market analysis, the appropriate annual lease rate was almost 3 times higher than the amount reflected in the outdated arrangements from years past. I stared at the number for several long moments, remembering the violation notice Patricia had confidently placed beneath my windshield only days after I inherited the ranch. Back then, she believed authority came from enforcing neighborhood rules. Now I understood that real authority came from respecting records, honoring agreements, and accepting responsibility when forgotten obligations finally returned to the surface. I closed the binder containing the completed proposal, placed it carefully inside my grandfather's weathered leather portfolio, and realized that the hardest part of the entire journey was no longer discovering the truth. The hardest part would be delivering it with enough patience and respect that an entire community could move forward without losing the place they proudly called home. 3 days later, every member of the Hollow Creek Estates board received an identical certified envelope delivered before noon. I made certain every packet looked professional, respectful, and impossible to misunderstand. There were no threats, no dramatic language, and no surprise legal demands hidden between the pages. Inside each envelope rested a cover letter, a complete historical timeline of the property, certified copies of the recorded surveys, tax records, title documentation, independent appraisal reports, and a proposed ground lease prepared by attorneys specializing in real property law. Every statement pointed back to a document. Every conclusion rested upon verified public records rather than opinion. My grandfather used to tell me that the strongest argument was the one that never needed raised voices, and as I watched the postal receipts arrive confirming delivery, I realized I finally understood what he meant. My telephone remained completely silent throughout the afternoon, which surprised me. I had expected immediate outrage or confusion. Instead, the first response arrived shortly after 8 o'clock that evening in the form of an electronic mail from Patricia. Her message was brief, courteous, and carefully worded. She requested an opportunity to discuss what she described as several unexpected historical records that required clarification before the board could respond. I accepted immediately. There was no benefit in creating unnecessary tension. 2 days later, I walked into the same clubhouse where I had quietly attended the monthly meeting only weeks earlier. This time the atmosphere felt entirely different. The polished conference table was covered with open binders, legal pads, highlighted maps, and laptop computers. Patricia sat beside the association's attorney, accompanied by several board members whose expressions revealed equal parts curiosity and concern. No one appeared angry. They appeared focused. That alone gave me hope. After brief introductions, the association's attorney thanked me for assembling such a detailed historical record. He admitted that several documents included in my packet had not appeared in the board's active files for many years, and that his office had already begun verifying each filing directly through county records. Hearing those words confirmed something important. The evidence was speaking for itself. I spent the next hour walking everyone through the timeline exactly as my own legal team had reconstructed it. I explained how the original developer had entered into a long-term ground lease with my grandfather, how successive amendments extended portions of that agreement over time, and how public records reflected no permanent transfer of the underlying acreage. Whenever questions arose, I simply turned another page and allowed the documents to answer them. No one interrupted. No one accused anyone else of wrongdoing. The room grew quieter with every file reviewed because the pattern became increasingly difficult to dispute. Eventually, Patricia folded her hands together and asked the question everyone had been avoiding since the meeting began. What exactly are you asking from the association? I looked around the room before answering because I wanted every board member to hear the same response. I told them I was not asking anyone to leave their home. I was not attempting to close parks, block roads, or interfere with daily life inside the neighborhood. The community had become part of the county's identity, and I respected that. What I wanted was something much simpler. I wanted the legal records supporting the community to reflect present reality instead of relying upon agreements that no longer existed. I then slid the proposed ground lease across the table. The association's attorney quietly reviewed the financial section before looking back toward me. The updated lease reflected current market valuations established through independent professional analysis. The annual rent was approximately 3 times higher than the amount associated with the outdated historical agreements. No one spoke for several long seconds. Patricia slowly read the figures again before asking how those numbers had been calculated. Instead of answering myself, I handed her the certified appraisal reports prepared by independent valuation experts. Comparable developments, regional lease rates, land appreciation, tax obligations, conservation costs, and infrastructure responsibilities had all been evaluated using accepted professional standards. Every calculation could be independently verified. There was nothing arbitrary about the proposal. It reflected the land's present value rather than the assumptions of decades past. As the meeting drew toward its conclusion, I noticed something that would have seemed impossible only a few weeks earlier. Patricia was no longer speaking from the certainty of authority. She was asking thoughtful questions, taking careful notes, and listening with the same patience I had shown from the very beginning. The room had transformed from a confrontation into a negotiation built upon facts instead of assumptions. Walking outside beneath the warm evening sky, I glanced toward the entrance monument where our story had quietly begun. The stone gates still welcomed families home exactly as they had every day before. Nothing visible had changed. Yet inside the boardroom, the foundation beneath everything they believed had shifted forever, and everyone now understood that the next decision would determine not only the future of the association, but the integrity of the community itself. The following week, the association's attorney requested one final meeting, this time inviting independent title specialists, surveyors, accountants, and the county's real estate records supervisor, so every remaining question could be answered in one room. I welcomed the idea because the truth becomes much stronger when everyone is allowed to examine it together. The meeting lasted nearly 6 hours. Maps covered nearly every available table, while historical photographs, engineering drawings, recorded surveys, and tax records were projected onto large screens around the conference room. Every question was answered with another document. Every concern led back to another verified public record. By the middle of the afternoon, the discussion had changed completely. No one argued about whether the Walker Family Trust still owned the underlying land. Instead, everyone focused on the best path forward for the families who called Hollow Creek Estates home. That shift mattered more to me than any legal victory ever could. Patricia remained surprisingly composed throughout the entire review. The confidence she had displayed during our first meeting had been replaced by something I respected far more: humility. At one point, she quietly admitted that every board she had served alongside had inherited records from previous volunteers and assumed those records were complete. No one had intentionally ignored the original agreements. They had simply trusted that someone before them had already confirmed everything. Hearing her say those words reminded me how easily assumptions could survive for decades when no one thought to ask difficult questions. Before the meeting concluded, the association's attorney stood and summarized the findings. Based upon the public record, the title history, independent legal analysis, and professional surveys, the board recommended accepting the updated ground lease rather than beginning years of unnecessary litigation that would only create uncertainty for homeowners. The room became completely silent. One by one, the board members nodded in agreement. Patricia looked toward me across the conference table and offered a sincere apology for the way our first meeting had unfolded. She admitted that placing violation notices on someone who actually owned the underlying property had become an irony she would probably never forget. I smiled because holding on to resentment would have accomplished nothing. We both shook hands, not because either of us had won, but because the community finally had an opportunity to move forward on solid legal ground instead of outdated assumptions. The revised lease was signed several weeks later after final legal review. Yes, the annual ground rent reflected current market conditions and was approximately 3 times higher than the outdated historical arrangement. But every dollar had a clearly documented purpose before the first payment was ever collected. A dedicated stewardship fund was established under Walker Land Stewardship with annual independent accounting requirements available for review. A significant portion supported long overdue road improvements throughout the surrounding rural area. Another portion funded shoreline restoration around the lakes, native grass rehabilitation across and used acreage, and wildfire prevention projects that protected both the ranch and the neighborhood. Scholarships were created for graduating high school seniors living inside Hollow Creek estates who planned to study agriculture, environmental science, engineering, or public service. Volunteer fire departments serving the surrounding county received updated equipment grants because my grandfather always believed protecting land also meant protecting the people living on it. As months passed, the changes became visible everywhere. Newly resurfaced roads reduced flooding after heavy rain. Walking trails received better drainage and safer lighting. Native trees replaced invasive species around the ponds, bringing back birds I had not seen there since childhood. Families continued fishing from the same docks, children still laughed beside the same playgrounds, and community events remained just as lively as before. The only difference was that everyone now understood exactly how the land beneath their neighborhood had been preserved for generations. One afternoon, I noticed Patricia standing near the entrance monument greeting new residents during a community welcome event. Instead of introducing the association as the owner of everything around them, she proudly explained the partnership that now existed between the neighborhood and the Walker Family Land Stewardship Program. She even pointed toward the restored open fields beyond the subdivision and explained why preserving them would benefit future generations instead of replacing them with more construction. Listening from a distance, I realized that the greatest change had never been the lease itself. The greatest change was that leadership had shifted from certainty without verification to responsibility, supported by truth. My grandfather once told me that good land could outlive every person who ever walked across it if someone cared enough to protect both the soil and the promises attached to it. Standing there beneath the same Texas sky where he had shared those words so many years earlier, I finally understood that the real inheritance he left behind had never been measured in acres alone. It had been measured in the patience to let facts speak louder than pride, and in the wisdom to use justice not as a weapon, but as the foundation for rebuilding trust. Nearly a year has passed since the morning I found that first violation notice beneath the windshield wiper of my truck, and sometimes I still keep the folded paper inside my grandfather's leather portfolio as a reminder that the smallest document can begin the biggest turning point in a person's life. Every few weeks I drive the same roads through Hollow Creek estates, but now I notice different things. I notice children casting fishing lines from the restored docks while their parents sit nearby, watching the sunset reflect across the water. I notice native wildflowers blooming where neglected drainage areas once struggled through every rainy season. I notice volunteer firefighters training with equipment funded by the stewardship program and graduating seniors proudly accepting scholarships that help them begin careers serving communities much like this one. None of those moments existed because someone won an argument. They existed because everyone eventually chose to respect the truth more than their pride. One afternoon, Patricia invited me to attend the annual community picnic, the same gathering I had quietly observed from a distance during my first week on the property. This time she introduced me very differently. Standing beside the entrance monument, she welcomed new residents before inviting me to share a few words about the history of the land beneath their neighborhood. Looking across the crowd, I saw families who had once unknowingly become part of a complicated legal question. Now they simply looked like neighbors enjoying a peaceful Saturday together. I told them about my grandfather without mentioning lawsuits, disagreements, or legal discoveries. I explained how he believed every generation borrowed the land from the next one, and that true ownership carried responsibility far greater than privilege. I described the importance of preserving open spaces, protecting natural resources, honoring written agreements, and asking careful questions before assuming someone else had already found every answer. When I finished speaking, there was no dramatic applause, no celebration of victory, and no sense that one side had defeated another. There was only quiet appreciation for a shared future built upon honesty instead of misunderstanding. After the event ended, Patricia walked with me toward the lake where we had first spoken months earlier. She admitted that inheriting leadership sometimes meant inheriting mistakes made long before anyone accepted the position. That sentence stayed with me because it applied to far more than neighborhood associations. Businesses, families, organizations, and even entire communities often carry forward assumptions simply because no one remembers how they began. We both agreed that asking respectful questions early could prevent far greater problems later. Before leaving, she handed me something I never expected to receive. It was the original violation notice she had written on my first day, neatly framed behind glass with a small brass plaque underneath that read, "Always verify before you assume." We both laughed because neither of us could have imagined that a simple parking citation would eventually become part of the community's history. The framed notice now hangs inside the office of Walkerland Stewardship, not as a trophy, but as a lesson. Visitors often ask why I display it so prominently, and I always answer the same way. It reminds me that every document deserves to be read carefully, every person deserves to be treated respectfully, and every disagreement deserves facts before conclusions. My grandfather's ranch house still overlooks the same rolling hills where he taught me to mend fences and watch the sunrise without rushing the day ahead. Sometimes I sit on the front porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the wind move through the oak trees while distant laughter drifts across the lake from families enjoying the neighborhood below. In those quiet moments, I finally understand the inheritance he truly intended to leave behind. It was never about possessing 1,800 acres. It was about protecting promises that could easily be forgotten when enough time passed. Land can be measured in acres. Buildings can be measured in square feet. Money can be counted on paper. But integrity is measured only by the choices people make after discovering the truth. Looking back, I never defeated a neighborhood, removed families from their homes, or celebrated another person's mistake. I simply honored my grandfather's records, followed the law with patience, and allowed verified facts to guide every decision until fairness replaced assumption. That is why the roads remain open, the lakes remain full, the community continues to grow, and the land my grandfather loved will be protected for generations still to come. If this journey taught me anything worth carrying forward, it is that justice does not arrive through the loudest voice in the room. It arrives through preparation, patience, responsibility, and the quiet strength to do what is right even when no one expects it. In the end, the most valuable inheritance was never the land beneath the neighborhood. It was the principle that truth, when handled with wisdom and respect, has the power to preserve both people and the places they call home.